Good morning. My name is Reverend Liz Aguilar, and I'm the pastor at Community Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Chula Vista. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all at First Church UCC in Middletown, Connecticut. So hello from the West Coast to the East Coast. And thank you to my friend, Reverend Dr. Virginia Child, for this invitation for us to do pulpit swaps in this virtual way. There are some good things that have come out of this strange time of pandemic, and one of them is that we do get to share now and then sermons across the miles and get different variety of perspectives from a variety of clergy. And so I do thank your pastor, Virginia, for allowing me to be with you during this time. Today we are both looking at the same scripture readings. I'm focusing on the gospel according to Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 39. And as today is the Sunday when we recognize the transfiguration of Jesus, we have both been given the task of reflecting about that same story. So I aim to do that in a way where hopefully we can draw upon some good lessons from this very fantastic story for our own lives today, in your context in Connecticut, and for us over here in California. Well, the first thing I want to lift up about this story is a very simple fact and a very honest fact, which is that this story is one of those very far out stories that we have in the New Testament. Now, I tend to believe the stories that did happen in Jesus' lifetime, especially when those stories are mentioned with more than just one of the gospel writers. And in fact, with this story, it does come up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so we have three of the gospel writers writing about the same account with some variations. So just to put in context a little bit, when does this event occur? Well, by now, you may remember that Jesus has been traveling with his disciples. It's about 3 years into his ministry that lasted 3.5 years. By now, Jesus is famous. Jesus is well known for his miracles, for his miracles of healing, for to be some refer to him as a prophet, others refer to him as a rabbi. And by now he has disciples, people who have been following him. And so at this time in the life of Jesus, Jesus has also begun to prepare the disciples about his eventual death. And at this point, we see that there's a level of confusion by the disciples. Why is Jesus talking about his death? And they don't understand that indeed he will die. And I'm sure they don't understand what would happen, transpire after. So historically, Transfiguration Sunday does come right before the season of Lent as a way to prepare ourselves for this special season of Lent when we focus more on those last days of Jesus' life. Well, in this story, we see right away that Jesus has gone up with Peter, James, and John, it says, to a high mountain apart by themselves. Now, what I like to do when I preach is just to invite people to put themselves into the story. And when I do that, right away, I try to picture myself being with Jesus and that word apart. I think if I had been one of those disciples, to have been invited with Jesus to spend some time in prayer by ourselves on some mountaintop, to tell you the truth, I'd be feeling pretty good about myself. In fact, I might have been tempted to think, wow, aren't we special? Of all the people that have been hanging around with Jesus, Jesus has called me and my few buddies here to be with him and to spend some time together on this beautiful mountaintop, I would have been tempted to focus on myself. And so what happens in this story? The story says that all of a sudden, it says in verse 2, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. So right away we see from the word transfigured that somehow Jesus' form changed in front of them. Now we're not given details, right? We're just given the sense that somehow we see the divinity of Jesus at this point. Now, in Mark's account, Mark does lift up very much the humanity of Jesus. But in this particular part of Mark's account, we see that Jesus is also fully divine. And to me, it's interesting that this would happen after those 3 years that Jesus has spent time with the disciples, showing them that, yes, I am human, but I am also fully divine. And this is one of those stories that show that he's both. And so it says, going on to the story, that there appeared with Jesus Elijah and Moses. Now, if you recall, Elijah and Moses would have been very important figures in the history of Judaism for these disciples. They would have recognized Moses and Elijah because they were great prophets. Moses would have symbolized the law, and Elijah was known to them as the greatest prophet ever. And so to have these particular leaders and prophets with Jesus would have given them a sense that Jesus is indeed an important person in the whole scope of their faith and their history. And so right away, we could imagine, again, if we're putting ourselves in that story, so there we are with Jesus, and we're one of those disciples, and we might be feeling really good about ourselves that Jesus, gave us the honor to be with him, and now all of a sudden, Jesus is somehow transformed in this dazzling white clothes, and then all of a sudden we see Elijah and Moses. Now, if I were one of those disciples, I would have gone from a time of feeling very good about myself to just complete awe and probably confusion. I would have felt fear too, knowing myself. And now, interestingly, Peter, now we know that Peter always had a reputation of being the first one, right? The first one to react, the first one to speak up. And so here's another example of that in verse 5. Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Then it goes on to say, he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. So indeed, they're full of fear. And Peter, again, Peter was one of those disciples to say what was at the top of his head, not necessarily reflecting before he's going to talk. And so he's just going to be honest and say what he's thinking. And at this point, he's thinking, well, let's set up these 3 dwellings, whatever the dwellings represented, but one for Jesus, one for Moses and Elijah. And remember, he's included himself by saying it's good for us to be here. I take it to mean that Peter was so excited, thinking, we could stay on this mountaintop. You, Jesus, with Moses and Elijah and us, the disciples, it doesn't get any better than that. Now let's pause a moment, because if we were to see ourselves as one of those disciples, it would be easy to understand ourselves as being important enough to be equal to them, or at least to want to stay on that mountaintop together, because they've seen what's in the valley already, right? They've witnessed Jesus. They've been a part of Jesus' ministry. They've seen the sick. They've seen the lame. They've seen people struggling in so many different ways. They've seen and they've lived themselves in hard circumstances. And so again, if we were any of them, we would be tempted to stay right up there on that mountaintop in those dwelling places. I certainly would have. And yet what happens? In verse 7, it says, "Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, 'This is my son, the beloved, listen to him.' And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus." You may recall those same words that came up before at the beginning of Jesus' ministry when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. At that point, we also heard a voice from the heavens saying, "Here is my beloved son, listen to him." So it's interesting that those words are coming up again towards the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. And we have, therefore, another confirmation of God through this voice saying, "Indeed, this is my son, and indeed you are to listen to him." Now, I think it's significant that this voice happens right after Peter said what Peter said, because it's a reminder, guess what? The focus is Jesus. The focus isn't you, disciples. The focus isn't even Elijah and Moses. The focus is Jesus, my son, my beloved son. Listen to him. You see, I take it as a reminder that what we do in ministry, what we do with our lives, our focus needs to remain on Jesus. That even though there are things that happen before us that don't make any sense to us, our goal is to focus on Jesus through those very strange times. Certainly now during this time of pandemic where, let's face it, it's felt like a roller coaster ride, hasn't it? We've started with a sense of confusion and fear, and then some hope, thinking that this pandemic can't last very long. And then we, of course, had the many difficult moments that were going on in our nation's capital, and then we had over the summer the very important demonstrations that happened across the country and even in other parts of the world, where people were showing how important it was for all people to be honored, especially people of color. And then we still continued with this pandemic. And then we know what happened in our nation's capital just a month or so ago. And then now we are finally getting vaccinated. It has certainly been a roller coaster ride, even this past year. And so I'm taking this story as a reminder, a very powerful reminder, that in the midst of all those changes, in the midst of so much that really has not made sense to me and to many of you, that God's love, God's presence remains constant in our lives. And that indeed, in the midst of all that doesn't make sense, we are called, invited to continue to focus on Jesus. And I know that's hard to do. I know that it's easier to be overwhelmed with fear, just as the disciples were. It's easier to be overwhelmed with confusion, with doubt. And those things are real and they're valid. But in the midst of all of that, we are invited to give God those fears. We're invited to give God our questions, to give God our confusion, and yes, to follow God back to the valley. As much as we would like to feel cozy and secure and safe with God, God calls us to be amongst God's people, showing God's love, inviting others to follow Jesus as well. What a privilege, what a responsibility to be Jesus' disciples today in this modern day and age. One of the good things that indeed has happened during this pandemic, as I said a little bit ago, is that God has given us opportunities to be the church in different ways. And it feels like that God is inviting us to do that almost overnight. Those of us who are clergy or church leaders, you know that we didn't have preparation for this time, but what we did have was faith. Faith in a God that is with us. Faith in a God that loved us so much that God came in flesh as Jesus the Christ. Faith in a God that tells us that no matter what changes happen in our lives, God remains constant, and that we in turn are called to be Christ's faithful disciples. Perhaps not having the answers, but having enough faith to continue to follow Jesus just as we are, with our doubts, with our fears, with our gifts, with our dreams, with all who we are, because the focus is Jesus and not ourselves. The focus is following Jesus through those rough times. The focus is being obedient to what Jesus calls us to do. Not having all the answers, but giving our questions to God and then following through with what God calls us to do. Friends, those of you who are listening to me in Connecticut, I don't know your particular situation there at your church or your community there in Middletown, but I do know that as modern day disciples, God invites you and God invites us to continue faithful as best as we're able to follow God, to serve God, and to do so as His disciples. Amen.